A cabin full of people sleeping peacefully turns into an absolute bloodbath as 4 of the occupiers are brutally slain. But that's not even the strangest or most morbid part of this story, and we're going to look into it tonight.
What you are about to hear is believed to be real, based on witness accounts, testimonies, and public record. This is terrifying and true.
This week we have a pretty disturbing story, not that that's new territory for us here at Terrifying and True on Weekly Spooky, but this one is extra creepy because as I record speaking to you right now, I'm actually in a cabin on a lake, though in Michigan and not California. But I'm not going to lie, this is a beautiful getaway that is very, very scary at night, and this story has brought quite a chill to my blood. So, let's get into the Keddie Cabin Murders, a story with many suspects, many twists and turns, and a lot of bloodshed. We're going to dive in after these quick words. On April 12th, 1981, in Keddie, California, the Sharp family, along with some friends of theirs, went to sleep in their cabin numbered 28, which was located in the Keddie Resort Lodge. But unlike just any other typical day, the morning that followed shocked the entire county. 4 people sleeping in that house were brutally murdered. 4 people who went to bed with plans for tomorrow were found with their lives taken. 3 of these people were found dead when the cabin was searched by Sheila Sharp, one of the Sharp's daughters who had slept at a friend's cabin next door. The victims included Sheila's mom, her 15-year-old brother Johnny Sharp, and Johnny's 17-year-old friend, Dana Wingate. But Tina, one of the Sharp sisters, were missing. Her remains were, however, identified by people in the area sometime after the event. Just let that sink in. You go to sleep over at a friend's for one night, and in the blink of an eye, all of your family members are dead, and one sister is missing. This entire situation is very unusual, not just because of the murder, but because Sheila's younger brother Greg and Rick were both found safe and sound asleep in their bedrooms. The boy's friend Justin Smart was also found in that room, sleeping away safely. What could precipitate this kind of selective murder spree? While it is a blessing that those kids were left alone, it's hard to imagine how 4 people were brutally murdered and the rest of them who were in the same cabin managed to stay asleep. There must have been some sort of resistance, perhaps a shout for help, or something that could have broken their slumber. All that being said, the news of the murder spread like wildfire, and tons of people gathered around the cabin. Johnny, Dana, and Sue were all found to be bound by some kind of electrical wiring. Murder weapons were abundant at the crime scene, including a bent steak knife, which was lying on the floor, a butcher knife drenched in blood, as well as a claw hammer. The walls and the ceiling were covered with blood splatter. A truly horrifying sight was reported by the people present at the crime scene. So far, Nothing seems to make sense in terms of solving this mystery. Why were they killed? Why did the killer spare some people, but had absolutely no mercy for others? And most importantly, who was the killer? First things first, let's take a look at some background on the family members of Sue Sharp and her children. Sharp was described as a quiet person who, like most other moms, loved her children immensely. She had recently left an abusive marriage and had moved to the Keddie area along with the kids in 1980 in the hope of giving herself and the children a better life. Other than this one detail, overall the family appears to be relatively average, but it's still a little too early to jump to any conclusions. Back at the Keddie cabin, Tina, one of Sue's daughters, who was missing, was eventually found. Well, not her, but her remains, namely, her skull. And it took 3 years to find it, and it was in another county, located 50 miles from the Keddie area. Everything about this is very suspicious, especially the timing and the fact that the caller who notified police about the skull identified it as Tina's. How could anyone just assume that it was hers unless, of course, they knew something sinister? There were 2 main suspects identified by the police, Martin Smart and Bo Bedetti, who lived just 2 cabins away from the Sharps. Now, what could be the possible incentive behind this murder? Well, Martin Smart was married to Marilyn Smart, who was the mother of Justin Smart, one of the kids who remained alive that horrifying night. But their marriage was not a happy one. Similar to Sue's circumstances, Marilyn also suffered at the hands of her husband, who was quite abusive towards her. Having learned from her own experience, Sue was counseling Marilyn regarding her marriage. After finding out about this interference in their relationship, Martin reportedly, quote, went ballistic about it. However, this isn't the only thing that contributed to the suspicion. Soon after the murder, Martin was quick to leave for Reno, Nevada. The police at that time, though, were convinced that this murder was not caused by one person alone, and that more than one individual was involved, which then led suspicion toward Martin's roommate, Bo. He was an ex-convict and made perfect sense as an accomplice to the crime. This case was particularly twisted and had a lot of questions that needed answers. The general public and people living in the neighborhood were traumatized by it, and they demanded explanations. The police, though, decided to, oddly, end the investigation there. A lot of evidence was ignored and suspects were never interrogated properly. Why? Well, there is still a question there. According to Mr. Wingate, the father of Dana Wingate, quote, the police had stumbled over each other and fouled up the case, and he is certainly not the only one who thinks so. Many people following the case agree that there's some kind of police involvement in the crime itself. We can't say anything for fact, but there are so many things that point towards a cover-up, with the police at the end of the road. Doug Thomas, who was the sheriff at that time, has especially been a center of this speculation and has been accused of a cover-up in many theories posted on the internet, which suggest that the sheriff and Martin Smart were close friends at that time. The sheriff did say that he held a session and advised the Smart couple a few days before the murder. But that somewhat unravels, because Marilyn does not recall any such meeting. She even went so far as to add that her husband and the sheriff were never friends. Based on this, and some other suspicious things about her, some people even suggest that Marilyn was a conspirator in the murders. To head back to our shady sheriff, he became very defensive about this whole situation and the allegations that were made against him. So when he noticed that there were quite a huge number of fingers pointing at him in fury and doubt, he stood up and talked to the local people. These were his exact words. There was no shortage of suspects, but suddenly now everybody 35 years or so later has all figured out what happened and that all of the investigating officers were corrupt. It's laughable is what it is. Martin Smart was not a friend of mine. At one point, he and his wife were having some marital issues and they came to my office when I was sheriff and wanted me to counsel them. Now, important to note here is the sheriff's insistence that counseling session happened, something that the wife completely denied. This raises even more questions than answers. Is the sheriff lying, or is the wife? And in either case, why? There could be multiple explanations. Maybe the sheriff was trying to conceal that friendship element here, or maybe the wife is trying to hide something by denying that encounter, either to save her husband or maybe herself. Once again, we can't really say anything for certain. But another fishy thing about this whole counseling scenario: why on earth would anyone go to the sheriff with their marital problems? It just seems unusual. But maybe it's more average in 1980s Keddie, California. Nonetheless, the murder case was then reopened in 2013 by Sheriff Greg Hagwood and Mike Gamberg. Both of them were personally related to the victims, which would explain why they took interest in the case after it had been closed so many years before. Hagwood commented on the police cover-up story, quote, "It has brought to light some amazing timelines, histories, and what some may call coincidence. Others may look at it more accusingly. I don't put anything outside of the realm of possibility." So based on this, we can tell that there is a new start to the investigation, and the police are diving into it with a more holistic approach, trying to consider all possible options and all possible clues that can help them reach their final destination. Several new and interesting developments followed quickly after this investigation began. First of all, Gamberg, who is the new police investigator we mentioned a few moments ago, found some very useful evidence that had been shoved aside. Most notably was one letter that had been given by Martin Smart to his wife, Marilyn, reportedly written soon after the murder took place. Here's what the letter read: "I've paid the price of your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we're through? Great. What else do you want?" That definitely sheds some potential light on this whole subject. The question, though, is, why would she want the family dead? Well, when Marilyn was confronted about the letter, she denied ever receiving it. However, she did recognize the handwriting in the letter was that of Martin. Secondly, Gamberg found another piece of evidence in the box of case files at the police department that had been purposefully shoved away. In this case, it was an audio recording, the taped phone call of the anonymous person that had informed the police about the remains of Tina Sharp, one of the murdered family members.
Well, I was watching the news, and they were talking about this skull they found at the foot of falls. They asked for any help. And I was just wondering if you thought of the murder up in Keddie, up in Plymouth County a couple years ago, where a 12-year-old girl was never found.
Now this is we're pretty sure it's a male skull.
Okay, well, I thought, just maybe a 12-year-old girl might be mistaken for a 10-year-old boy.
And that was Keddie, K-E-D-D-Y?
K-E-D-D-I-E.
Okay.
That's in Plymouth County.
And that's a couple years ago?
A couple years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago.
Oh, okay. I'll let my investigators know about it.
Okay.
Thank you. You have a text, Carter?
Thank you.
The audio of that 911 call was then analyzed and compared to the suspects. Hagwood commented on this tape with the following words: "Why that sat in a sealed evidence envelope, never opened, I don't have an answer to that, but we have it now." The third development was brought to the limelight by Gamberg, who spoke to Martin Smart's former therapist in Reno, Nevada. And lo and behold, the therapist informed the police that Smart had in fact confessed to the murder during one of the therapy sessions. The therapist also added that he was quite surprised that the investigators at the time of the murder had not used the confession against him. Clearly, the policemen at the time weren't exactly doing their jobs, and at this point, it's not really a secret, but the therapist seems quite interesting too. Someone just confessed to murdering 4 people. That goes well beyond the traditions of client privilege. Next comes the fourth development. Further investigation by the police officers led to the discovery that a man had reportedly found a steel blue-handled claw hammer using a metal detector near a pond in the area where the crime occurred, in Keddie. This hammer was very similar to one that Smart had told investigators he had lost some time before. Here's what Sheriff Hagwood says about this. Quote, "There are people locally who know more than they've said, and I believe we've identified some of them. And we know who they are, and we know where they are, and I have every confidence that they either participated after the fact or they have first-hand information." Hagwood also highlighted that 6 people were of keen interest to the police in the matter, and all of them were alive. Furthermore, concerning the 2 suspected killers, Smart and Bo Bedetti, Hagwood said the following: "It's a theory that we are working to the degree possible to conclude or dismiss. There is a disproportionate amount of evidence and information that tends to point in that direction. However, up until this day, no charges have been pressed, and many questions about the murder remained unsolved and unanswered. One of the investigators involved in the case says that there is no expiration date on homicides, and with surviving siblings and family members, it's their fundamental obligation to understand who did this and why." Looking back, this story gets more and more interesting, and I do wonder, was the sheriff simply incompetent, or was there something devious going on? A general rule I live by is that you should assume ignorance before you assume malice. Maybe he was just not a very good police officer. Maybe he was just a little on the lazy side, comfortable with his small-town sheriff appointment, and when a crime came above his pay grade, he dropped the ball. It could be ego that makes him refuse to accept responsibility. Or it could be something more sinister. Anything I say here is strictly speculation, but I can tell you one thing. When I go to sleep tonight in my little cabin in Michigan, I'm going to keep one eye just a little open because I've got the creeps, and that's what these shows are all about. So thank you so much for joining me on this story here on Terrifying and True. I hope you're having a great week. I hope you're staying warm. I hope you're staying safe. And I look forward to talking to you again on Wednesday and Monday. It's a highlight of my week. But for now, I'm going to enjoy my work retreat a little bit more, and I assure you, you'll all have something very special when I return home. Take care. Terrifying and True is narrated by Henrique Couto, executive produced by Rob Fields, and produced by Dan Wilder. The original theme song is composed and performed by Ray Mattis. All other music is from Audioblocks. A huge thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay just a little bit more to hear their names on the show. And they are Kelly Oram, Julia Kirsch, Christopher Sullivan, Brent McCullough, Gino Lyons, Steve King, Karen Ouimet, Jack Kerr, Jeff and George Hilton, Craig Cohen, and Kevin Fry. Thank you all so much. And if you want to join them in supporting the program, just go to weeklyspooky.com and click on Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can help us keep going and going and going, and you'll get bonus episodes as well. And if you have a story you'd like us to cover, send us an email at weeklyspooky@gmail.com.